All right. Well, welcome everyone to Tuesday morning Bible study. Today we are looking at Genesis chapter 9. Genesis chapter 9. Now, I know that some of you like to read ahead. I know that if I were in your position, I would want to do that just to kind of know whether I should skip or not. Um, but if you did that, you would know today is not the day to skip. If you can at all make it, because this is a very, very interesting passage. And as I, in a tongue-in-cheek way, pointed out, uh, I look forward to getting to the second half of this chapter because it's really interesting, and there's a lot of history behind it, as you might imagine. We'll get to that in just a little bit. So let's look. Who did we lose just now? Oh, okay. So, okay, Sandy's there. Okay, we didn't lose it. Okay, I don't think we lost anybody. Did we? Okay. All
Sorry,
right.
I'm waiting for a call from Cecil, so I'll just mute myself and in the
Oh,
background.
okay. Okay. My screen changed, and I had to do a double take and say, okay, wait a minute, what happened? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. And of course, as usual, we're recording the entire session. So, like Phyllis, if you have to step away, you can. About 2 o'clock this afternoon, the video will be sent out to you. Will be on the YouTube page so you can see it. Okay, well, let's open up our Bibles then to Genesis chapter 9. We will recall that the last thing that we read and studied at the end of chapter 8 was the change of mind and heart that God had. It is as though God, in this whole narrative, God has been in a relationship of give and take with his creation, as if God did not necessarily expect every single thing that happened, and yet God is working with everything that is happening and making choices along the way to maximize the good and make the best of what at this point is an admittedly uh, broken situation, but God making the best of it. And notably, and this was the big point of last week, the point that God is no longer going to use, lack of a better way of putting it, the nuclear option. We may use the nuclear option, but God is not going to use the nuclear option with the human race going forward. Now, today, that covenant with Noah and his descendants is formalized. And so, beginning at verse 1, we're going to let's read through verse 17, and then we'll go back and look at the details. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the air, on everything that creeps on the ground and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own life blood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you, be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth, and multiply in it." Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. All right. Let me just say one thing, and then I want to open it up to any comments, whatever. Despite the fact that there is so much repetition in the latter half of the selection that I just read, that is the hand of one author. That is not, unlike some other things that we've seen, is not, in fact, a patchwork of multiple hands being put together by a redactor. That passage I just read is the work of one hand, and it is the priestly author. All right. So what are some things you notice in this extended passage?
I have to say, I was actually really startled. I mean, it's not as though I haven't, in different modes of my life, read Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's as if I'd never seen the part of verse 6.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because I have, I've always, my wiring my default mode has always been not the taking of life. And that in my Catholic family and friends, and the whole fierceness around abortion, and many of them believe in capital punishment. I mean, and I've always felt in myself this line about it is not mankind's place to judge and take life. And then right here in verse 6 of chapter 9 of Genesis, and then in the long footnote about it, this is God's requirement. And it's been very not just confusing, but unsettling to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can absolutely understand that.
And then the verse before that about I will require a reckoning from, I mean, it's a blood reckoning, and that so fits into the struggle I've had in the recent years of my life around all of the theories around atonement and crucifixion and blood sacrifice and all that kind of stuff, which has been a stormy wind for me in my church life.
Sure.
So anyway,
Sure.
that's just where I am with.
Yeah. Well, let me say in response, one of the truly liberating things about a non-literalist, more progressive reading of the Bible, one of the great liberating things is that, for one, you don't have to feel any theological or moral obligation to take as gospel any particular thing that appears early on in the biblical revelation. The point is that in biblical revelation, in the biblical story, there's progress, there's evolution, there's change.
Thank you for reminding me of that. I need to be reminded of that.
Yeah, I mean, the same Bible that says, there's a wonderful meme, and I'll try to find it and I'll send it to all of you. There's a wonderful meme that says, early on in the Bible, in the telling of the story, there are a number of things that are prohibited, or a number of people you're not to talk to or have relations with. And then yet, as the story goes on, things evolve, things change, and suddenly the things you weren't, things that are clean and unclean I mean, there were great prohibitions about eating foods that were unclean. And then, suddenly Peter has a dream in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Suddenly all those things, you can eat those things, rise, kill, and eat, Um, and
But we're asked to take very seriously God's grief, God's change of heart, God's determination that even though the human heart is corrupt, the human heart is evil, and we're to take very seriously God's change of heart and God's covenant to never again destroy
yeah.
the whole of living kind. Yeah. So anyway,
Well, this is another good example too of why it is so important not to take things that you read in the Bible out of context and treat them as if they are true for all times and places, because to read this this verse 6 in the right way is to read it in the context of what has just happened. That what has just happened is a flood was sent, and the reason the flood was sent, if you recall, is violence. That violence was the great thing that was in mind. That murder and violence were pandemic, to use a word that we're very used to at this point, was pandemic in the world. And so the flood was sent. And then, of course, God has the change of heart, saying, okay, look, I've seen what I've done. I'm not ever going to deal with this problem in this way ever again. But murder and violence is very serious. I mean, after all, when you murder someone, you are killing someone made in my image, made in the image of God. And therefore, again, this is God responding to circumstances. There's got to be a reckoning for that. You kill someone who's made in the image of God, there has to be a reckoning for that. And that is God's, this is the character of God in this story, responding to the fact that even after the flood, God acknowledged at the end of chapter 8 that the tendency towards violence is still there. It's, as the text puts it, that the human heart is inclined to evil even after the flood. The thing that has changed is not human beings. Human beings are still as screwed up as they ever were. What's changed is God's response. And at this point, part of God's response after the flood and after the decision not to destroy the whole world is that there has to be punishment. There has to be retribution for murder.
Mm.
And so in that context, with what has just happened, that's an understandable response to that concrete situation. Now, of course, also to remember too that this is being narrated by a Israelite historian, in probably, at this point, probably, what's the priestly author, but then put together later by the redactor. This is someone telling the story of Israel's history, and this is yet before Israel is even a nation, and so there's still a little bit of explaining why things are the way they are. We're still early on, that we're still telling, the historian is still telling stories as to why people have pain in childbirth, and things like that. And so there's some of that here, explaining why it is that the system is set up the way it is. Why do we respond to murder with, a blood reckoning? Why do we respond in this way? Well, we do it because we the Israelites, not we today, but we the Israelites of the 5th century BC, we respond in this way because murder is a violation of the image of God, and that is why we do it. And so establishing that reason in the narrative that ultimately leads to Israel and beyond. But as I've already said, the story evolves. God himself changes. God himself evolves in this story, and the thing God commands also evolve. Yeah.
I've been sitting here listening to this, and I have a real problem, but I think you just explained it in your last few sentences.
Okay, good.
I have a real problem thinking of God as changing, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about God changed his mind and blah, blah, blah. I have always thought that, no, God is never changing. Our concept of what happens and who God is and what God does is what changes. And that makes sense to me. But it doesn't make sense to me to think that God, himself, herself, itself, whatever, changes. I want to believe that God has always been the same. But like you were saying, the Israelites look around and they try to explain what's happening, and then I can understand that. But it makes me uncomfortable for us to say God changed his mind, and therefore he'll never do this again.
Totally. No, I hear you. Here's another version of the same liberating thought that I offered earlier, and that is, there is not a single word in this entire book. There is not a single word in this entire book that did not come from the pen and thus the mind of a human being. Not a single word, not a single concept, not a single story that did not come through a human filter to write those words down. And when a human being wrote those words, they were writing from their own experience of life. When there are versions, as we all know, there are versions of the idea of scriptural inspiration, of biblical inspiration, the idea that the Bible is in some sense the Word of God. There are versions of that doctrine that make the human element in the creation and the transmission of biblical texts completely insignificant. That completely erases the human part, as if the Bible is the consequence of the Holy Spirit taking over the body of a human being and them writing the words of God exactly, and that every verb tense and every punctuation mark, not that there are punctuation marks, but every single little thing was under the direct control of God. Okay.
Well, sort of like the 10 Commandments. I mean, we sort of accept the fact that Moses was given those 10 Commandments without really questioning whether God did that or not. But yeah, the Bible.
Yeah.
There are people who really believe the Bible was literally written by God, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are plenty of people out there who do. I have tried to explain for years why I just don't think that works at all.
No,
I respect people and their right to believe what they believe, but I don't think that works at all. It just doesn't work for a whole host of reasons: theological, historical, moral, all kinds of reasons that doesn't work.
This is human.
When we see the Bible, when we see the Bible as not that way, but rather as coming through human consciousness, coming through the human mind, it's going to reflect, it's going to show all the signs, all the marks of a human composition. It's going to reflect human worldviews. I mean, the fact that, in Genesis chapter 1, we're given the account of creation and we're told of a firmament, separating the waters from the waters, that's obviously not, a literal statement of what the
Fact.
cosmos is like, but it's what somebody writing in the 6th century BC, how they saw the cosmos, and they saw the cosmos like that. And so they were expressing their ideas in the concepts they knew. And we should expect to see that. We should expect to see all of that. The Christian affirmation, or that is to say, I think that the affirmation that we as Christians and as a church wrestling with these texts today is that we affirm that the same God who was at work and alive in the history of those communities that created these texts is alive and at work in our time too, where I'll tell you what it doesn't mean. It does not mean that in order to be faithful, that we have to adopt the worldviews and the cosmologies of people who lived 3,000 years ago. Okay. We do not have to do that in order to be faithful. We can absolutely embrace the modern scientific view of things and understand that no, they're not waters and water, waters separated from waters. There are stars and black holes and galaxies and all of that. And we are not in the slightest being unfaithful when we affirm all of that. What we do affirm is that just as those people of ancient times wrestled with their experience of God in their own history, sought to understand what for them was history, looking back from their standpoint, they told the story in a way that made sense to them, sometimes that served their interests, okay? But nevertheless, telling the story as they could, as working with the concepts and the language, the ideas that they had available to them. And when we then read their writings, we have to take all of that into account, which is why we do, the historical and the contextual reading that we do. We do not have to adopt every single theological construct that they adopted. One of the theological constructs that's clearly in view here is that God changes his mind. Okay, for some of these Old Testament authors, not all of them, by the way, but some of them, that was how they understood what God was doing, what the mystery of God was up to. Was that the way I can best express this is by telling a story in which God appears as a character who is evolving with circumstances, doing the best he can, changing his mind, taking action, understanding that all of that is coming through a human filter, when we read that text, we take that into account, and we prayerfully and in community seek to discern what God was doing and what God is doing now, and what this text might mean for us today, even though sometimes doing that can feel like a big stretch. Okay, I mean, obviously, like when we're reading those first few verses of chapter 6, And that's a really wonderful example of what in the ever living whatever do we do with those first few verses of chapter 6, you know? And the truth is I suppose there's not much we do with it other than to say that while the ancients may not have had their ideas of cosmology quite literally right, there were many things about human nature that they did understand and understood quite well. And we have seen that again and again as we've been reading through. We've been seeing the insight into human nature and the way the mind and the soul work. That's one area where the ancients, where we don't have anything on the ancients, or have very little, is that they did understand some things about human nature and about the nature of shame, the nature of guilt. And so here we are, you know, they're telling this story and they're trying to tell the national narrative of Israel, and it's before Israel is even come into existence. And so now the historian has established the process of retributive justice. And here's the reason. Here's the reason that this is the way it is. It's because of that great theological affirmation that we're all created in the image of God. Again, that is going to evolve over time, as we know, and as we'll see. Even that's going to evolve over time, so that we get to the New Testament and we get to to scenes of where Jesus seems to have an attitude of kind of letting people off, in the name of grace. And so there's that. But that's what the writer is going for right now, is establishing why the system is the way it is, and it's rooted in that theological affirmation that we're all created in the image of God. One thing that's really interesting about this passage too, do you notice how the justice and the covenant, the covenant that God is making about not destroying, and the notion of justice, the retribution, applies both to human beings and to animals.
Mm-hmm.
The covenant of life, the covenant that I'm not going to destroy everything. It's not just, I may send something in the future and I'm not making any promises for for the animals, but I'll protect you. No, the promise is for everything, for every living thing. And so and therefore human beings and animals, this is a great dynamic here in these chapters. Human beings and animals are connected. There's a deep connection between human beings and animals. And yet, we've seen how the relationship between human beings and animals has evolved. Talk about not taking any one prescription, any sentence of God, as true for all times and places. Just a few chapters ago, the commandment was just plants for food. And now circumstances have changed. The situation on the facts on the ground have changed. So now we see here in chapter 9, you can have the plants and you can have all the animals. And so originally it was kind of understood that there was nonviolence directed towards the animals. But then we saw that little hint when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit. And then it said God clothed them with skins. Mm-hmm. So where did those skins come from? Something has changed even there, even as a consequence of eating the forbidden fruit. Something has changed. And now, following the flood, suddenly the animal kingdom is at human beings' disposal. Suddenly now human beings, that while living things are protected sort of in the broader scheme of things, vis-a-vis God, the relationship between the animal kingdom and human beings has changed such that animals are now fit for consumption by human beings. This is an interesting evolution that takes place just in these few chapters. The relationship between animals and human beings evolves.
Well, as a vegetarian, I wish it had never happened. I'm curious to think, all right, if that hadn't happened and if all the way through this, it had been you only eat the plants, I wonder how much influence that would have on us today. I know it would not. I mean, people would still be eating meat, I'm sure, but there probably be a lot of people who would not because the Bible has said they shouldn't. So I kind of wish that that was the way it was.
Is
Yeah,
that
well, yeah. I was going to say there's some passages which they're understandable historically and contextually, but at the same time, when they are taken literally today, they actually can work against our broader human interests right now. I think it's probably true that if we human beings have a long-term future and climate change and all of that, that's a big if, but that if we have a long-term future, the way human beings eat is going to be part of what makes it possible for human beings to have a long-term future. Because the current path that we're on of meat consumption is environmentally and ecologically unsustainable.
Oh, yeah.
It's just unsustainable over the long haul. And I love, my mom knows I love a good steak as much as anybody. I love a good steak as much as anybody, but I also recognize that folks, I mean, the world of 50 years from now is going to, the world is changing quickly, even, right as we speak. But, just to give us a little distance, the world that will be 50 years from now is going to be a very different world, than it is right now. It just will be. And it will be all about, it'll be all integrally connected to the environmental and ecological impacts of current practice. And that's some bad news. I hate to rain on all our parades, but that's a little bad news. But that's just the truth. And there doesn't seem to be much social or political will to do very much about that. And that's sad.
Is chapter 4, is that the basis for kosher?
What
Is it- You must not eat meat that still has lifeblood still.
Yes, yeah, or that's sort of the beginnings of it. Yeah.
Mhm.
There are a few things in chapter 9, actually, as we will see, there are a few things in chapter 9 that are the beginning hints of what will become Israel and the particularly Jewish relationship with God. And this is the beginning of what will become, a kosher diet and all of that. Yeah. So yes. So the answer is yes. One other little point before we move on to the second half of this chapter. I want you to look at the rainbow, the whole business about the bow. I think I like, probably you are probably like me in that you're familiar with this text. You're familiar with the fact that a rainbow is the sign of the covenant. And you've always thought of the bow as just something beautiful. And it is, of course. A beautiful rainbow is a beautiful thing to look at. And that somehow its beauty in the middle of or on the backside of a storm is is that great reminder of this covenant that God is making with Noah, that it's beauty that is the great reminder. Contextually, while that's true, and while I think beauty is always a good reminder of any number of wonderful things about life, contextually, the beauty is not actually the thing that's supposed to be the great reminder. It's the fact that in ancient iconography, so often the great high gods or the great storm gods are often depicted in ancient art as wielding a bow in war. And when they wield the bow in war, sometimes other gods are on the receiving end of those bows. But as often, or if not more often, those on the receiving end of those bows are human beings. It's God's, well, it's like Yahweh destroying the Egyptians. It's bad human beings. The bad guy human beings are on the receiving end of that divine action, right? And so often in this art, the divine warrior, the storm god or whatever is depicted with a bow and about to use it for destructive purposes. Now, what would it mean then for a bow to appear in the sky, but with no one holding it? It's like God, the divine warrior, who was wielding the bow on human beings with the flood, has now hung the bow up, has retired from acts of destruction.
And also the arrow is nowhere to be found.
That's right. It's just the bow. It's a reminder that it happened. We remember that there was a day when that sort of thing happened, but it doesn't happen now because God has retired from that kind of activity. And so that's the great reminder. The empty bow, the bow with no one wielding it, with no arrows in it. That's the reminder that God's not going to wreak this kind of havoc ever again. That's the intention of the writer when telling the story of the bow that appears in the clouds. It's referring to that ancient art of divine warriors with wielding bows in destruction.
Those people in Nashville wondered about that, though.
Oh gosh. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Well, at our when we wind up today and we pray, let's do remember the those in Nashville, also those in Birmingham and
Gainesboro, Tennessee, where
yeah,
my son is, he was flooded.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
and of course Noonan, Georgia too. And it's just we've had some awful weather here of late. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on then. Let's look at verse 18. Let's go on to verse 18. All right. I'm going to read this and then I'm going to actually, let me say this before I read this. The authorship has changed here. Verse 18 and towards the end of the chapter, this is the Yahwist writer again. This is our friend who brings us stories of God physically walking through a garden, This is the guy who brings us the stories of angels looking lustfully on the daughters of men, and I mean some of the much more earthy stories. This is the Yahwist writer. This section appears to have been originally an independent piece of tradition, okay, that the Yahwist writer did not invent. It's in many ways, it's like the way how the flood traditions or the creation traditions were not invented by the writers. They were actually inherited, but then adapted, then changed and altered for the writer's purposes. Okay, this is a great example of this passage here is a great example of this. It seems to have originally been an independent piece of tradition that the Yahwist writer took and weaved into his narrative, okay, for a reason, and we'll see it in just a second. All right, verse 18. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, and lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Talk about a final story about
All
Noah.
of a sudden, Canaan's the bad guy.
Well, I say, what's that? What's that, Beth?
All of a sudden, Canaan's the bad guy. I didn't see anything
Yeah,
that he
yeah.
did.
Right.
So why was Ham skipped over?
That's
I mean-
a great question. And exactly the right one to be asking. Exactly. Because originally, what we think is originally, at least in the tradition as handed down to the Yahwist writer, Canaan probably didn't figure into this story at all. This was probably entirely a story about Shem, Ham, and Japheth and Noah. This is a great example of how tradition can be received, but then be tinkered with in order to achieve certain purposes. You're right. You're right to point out Canaan just seems to kind of
He just appears.
just suddenly appear.
Oof.
Well, let me just say that the reason he suddenly appears is not because it was originally in the tradition. It wasn't. It was important to the Yahwist writer to put Canaan into this previous tradition of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Ham, as it's a seeing his father's nakedness and telling his brothers about it, and then shame being on Ham, right? That was the original story. And we could talk till the cows come home as to what the purpose, if any, of the original tradition was. What's easier to answer is what the purpose of the Yahwist writer was in adapting this story. Take a wild guess.
He didn't like Canaan.
He didn't like Canaan. Or the Canaanites. Okay. Or the Canaanites. And in telling the story of Israel, he wants to, well, once again, the writer wants to establish why things are the way they are. Or that the way things are now in our own time, when I, the Israelite historian, either in our present time or in our recent past, we know we had a whole bunch of problem with the Canaanites. Well, that problem with the Canaanites
Started here.
back, yeah, exactly. It has its roots way back in prehistory. And in other words, it was like it was in the stars. It was practically in the stars that Israel and Canaan, from the Israelite historian's point of view, that it was almost written in the stars that Israel and Canaan were going to have conflict. And this is where it started. It started when Ham uncovered his father's nakedness, or did not cover up his father's nakedness, saw his father's nakedness, and brought shame on himself. And so the Alwist writer then says, this is an opportunity. Because Canaan, I'll bet Canaan was Ham's son, right? And then that establishes the great reason why Canaan, the Canaanites, those of Canaan, were rightfully overthrown and destroyed by the people of Israel coming into the promised land. Yeah,
They were guilty of association.
they were guilty from the beginning. That's what justifies Joshua's treatment of them later, right?
Mhm.
That's what
But they
justifies it, because they were
they didn't
screwed up and corrupted from the beginning. Right.
But
This
this
is also
really do anything. He just, because Ham did something wrong and he was the son, he was guilty by association.
Guilty by association, right? Yeah, Lois.
there was that early tradition that the sins of the fathers will be visited on the children, and this seems to be one of the earliest of that tradition.
That's true.
That's going to come up again. I mean, it goes without saying. That little bit is going to come up again. We're going to see that. But yeah, so this is it's fascinating how this tradition, which probably originally did not have Canaan as part of the story, part of the tradition, was changed, was altered in order to make a polemical point. Okay. Now, something that's really interesting about this is that there may be a lot more to this tradition than initially meets the eye. All right. Because if you just read it in English and you are not inclined to read between the lines, okay, what it sounds like has happened, what sounds like is going on is Ham walks in and sees his drunk father asleep and unclothed, and does not cover him with a sheet, and goes out and tells his brothers, hey, dad's inside the tent drunk and naked. And then the other two sons shield their eyes, go in, cover their drunk father. And then when their drunk father wakes up, curses Ham for not, for seeing his nakedness and not covering it up. That's what it sounds like, just kind of on a straightforward reading. There are at least a few reasons why there is probably more going on in the tradition. Okay. In other words, there's more that the writer is trying to communicate about the wrongness of all this. And by extension, as Bev has pointed out, by extension, the corruption of Canaan, all right, than might have initially meet the eye. Let's take a look real quick. Hold your place here, and let's look at a couple of places where, well, let's look at one other place where nakedness is seen. All right. This is the R-rated part of our Bible study today. Okay.
Okay.
Don't invite any underage people to hear this part of the Bible study. This is R-rated stuff here. Hold your place in Genesis. Turn, if you will, to Leviticus. Just a few books over. To Leviticus chapter 18. Okay. And we are going to look at verse 6 and following. All right. It says, none of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or abroad. And it goes on. I mean, it gets kind of repetitive, almost comical. I could imagine Saturday Night Live doing something with this, but I mean, there's a whole, just a litany of those you shall not uncover the nakedness of. Okay.
Well, that's not how mine is translated.
How is yours translated?
The whole thing, instead of nakedness, says intercourse. I mean, it comes right out and says what we're talking about here. So
That is exactly right. To uncover the nakedness. Yeah, say that, Beth. What's that?
Is it?
Mine says sexual relations.
Sexual relations, right. Uncover the nakedness of, in this material, is a beautiful biblical euphemism for have sex with. Okay. So uncovering the nakedness of your mother or of your mother's daughter or whatever is don't have sex with your mother. Don't have sex with your mother's daughter. Don't have sex with your father. It's basically establishing that
No one's.
sexual relations are a good creation of God, but you're not meant to have it with everybody. Okay. There are limits to who you can have sex with and who you can have sex with and who you can't have sex with. Okay.
So it's about incest. It's not about sex being bad and dirty.
That's right. It's about incest. These are prohibitions in Leviticus here. These are prohibitions against incest.
Oh yeah, I realize that. I was just laughing.
Oh, no, you should. It's absolutely right that you should. The point here is that biblically, in terms of the Hebrew, the euphemism for all of this is uncovering nakedness. That's how it literally, if you were taking the Hebrew and you were translating the phrase literally, the phrase would translate into English as uncovering nakedness.
But in the Genesis piece, Ham only witnessed his father's nakedness.
Well, he saw
Is that
it.
so? Is that having intercourse?
Well, that's a great question, isn't it? He
I mean,
saw it. He saw his father's nakedness. And that's the euphemism used in Leviticus 18 is you shall not see or you shall not uncover, but the seeing of nakedness, the uncovering of nakedness or the seeing of nakedness. And we're going to get to seeing in just a minute because there's a whole bunch of stuff that's packed into that innocuous word seeing. Okay. We'll look at that in just a minute. Uh, that to uncover nakedness is a euphemism for sexual relations. And it might lead us to wonder what is actually the intention of the author in saying this about Ham. Okay, now with that thought in mind, let's look at a few examples of how the verb, and I forget what the Hebrew word is, but when the word see or seeing or saw is used in the text. Let's look actually back at a couple of Genesis examples of what is going on when the text goes out of its way to say that so-and-so saw something, and then observe what follows. For example, hold your place here in chapter 9, but turn to chapter 3, Genesis chapter 3. Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. This is, of course, a passage we've already looked at, but there are some things we didn't know to look for before. Now we do. Now we can go back and read maybe with some additional understanding. Chapter 3, verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was to be desired to be made to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. We call it the forbidden fruit for a reason, okay? She saw it and desired it, okay? There's that. Now, turn to chapter 6.
Her eyes were open too, so that
Her eyes were open. Yeah. She saw it. She noticed it. It was desirable, right? Okay. Chapter 6. Chapter 6. This is our fun story about the Nephilim, right? When people began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves. Okay. That seeing, the way the verb that translates as seeing or saw into English, here in these chapters of Genesis, there's a pattern. There's a pattern to this, and it has to do with desire. When you see something, what follows is that you must have it. You see the forbidden fruit and you want it. You see the daughters of men and you want them, Now, here's the thing. The reaction to Canaan, or the reaction to Ham and by extension Canaan in this passage, the severity of the reaction is a piece of evidence that what was actually being communicated by the tradition is something stronger than just, oopsie, didn't mean to see. That there's more to it, and that it is in the vein of something incestuous. Okay. And if this is true, it explains the writer's very severe reaction to the Canaanites, to Canaan, associating Canaan and its inhabitants as a land of perverse people. Okay, they're not just they're not just bad. They're not just the descendants of somebody who had an oopsie, of descended from somebody who had an oopsie moment. So, oh, I didn't mean to see your, didn't mean to see my dad naked. But there's something perverse in their character. Biblical scholars will admit, the folks that I've heard, the biblical scholars that I've consulted, will say that we will never finally know for sure what the tradition intended, because it doesn't spell it out. But there's enough there. There's enough there between what uncovering nakedness means, or the refusal to cover nakedness, to see nakedness, and then combine that with the extreme severity of the reaction against Canaan in the story. All of that combined would seem to suggest that what the tradition was intending to convey was something incestuous, something perverse, which then leads to the condemnation of the spinning of the story in the direction of condemning the land of Canaan, condemning the Canaanites, and that this was the Yahwist writer's purpose in adapting the pre-existing tradition in the interest of telling Israel's national narrative, in which a villain is established early on.
That just seems, it seems like then that the Yahwist had a fixed idea about the evils and the perversity of the Canaanites as a people, and in the history of Israel.
In the history of Israel.
In the history of Israel, that was his fixed point of view, and that he was just writing the story to substantiate that, which we do all the time in our own history, much to our dismay, because there's not even any linking in the way he used the Ham story and the nakedness with desire. There was no link there like there was in seeing the fruit or the Nephilim, desiring. So it was as though it was having a fixed point of view and then just crafting his story to substantiate that point of view.
Yeah, I think that's probably about right. Yeah. And remember now, of course, from the writer's point of view, the days of Joshua, and the conquest of Canaan, that was probably, from the writer's point of view, that was probably 300 years in the past. Yeah, that was probably 300 years in the past at that point. And so again, where the writer is telling Israel's story and may have in mind, in trying to narrate things that happened in the primordial past, has in mind things that he knows happened before him, but happened after primordial times. And so he's like holding all of this in his mind. And so to take a pre-existing tradition and to adapt it so as to make Canaan the son of Ham, for one thing, and then be able to use the tradition to condemn Canaan and his descendants in such a wholesale way, that fit his purposes very nicely as the teller of a grand Israelite narrative. But yeah, I would make the case that the way it gets adapted and the way it gets understood, even whether the tradition meant it this way or not, which I would argue it did mean it this way. But certainly by the time it gets into the hands of the Yahwist writer, I would definitely say that the Yahwist writer definitely wants you, wants you to make that incestuous connection. Given the way it's the same writer, it's the same Yahwist writer who uses the verb see to see in this way in these multiple places. That seeing in this fashion always involves desire and a desire to possess. And the more perverse I, the Yahwist writer, can make this, the more justified my Israelite ancestors were in wiping those folks out when they arrived into the promised land. And of course, they didn't wipe them out. There were plenty of Canaanites left behind, and throughout the history of the Israelite kingship, from the time of, from David to the time of the Babylonian exile, there were, as you know, there were always those in modern day Israel who worshiped the Canaanite gods of Baal. When you think of Baal worship, and remember that Baal was two principal things in terms of his divine picturing, or the way we understand Baal. Baal was a storm god. Okay, Baal was a storm god, and by extension, storms, rain. He was a god of fertility. And take a wild guess as to something that was heavily involved in rites worshiping Baal. Fertility related things, right? Sex was part of ritual practice in the worship of Baal. Well, Israelites who were worshiping Yahweh, nope, none of that. And so it would be natural for them, in looking at the Canaanites, to see the lot of them as a lascivious, perverse lot. Okay. I will say that this is not the last time that we're going to encounter a sex-related, R-rated story in the book of Genesis. I'll just go ahead and warn you now. There are multiple examples in the book of Genesis where we're going to run into some pretty racy stuff. But this is when we understand that this is all part of the crafting of the grand Israelite narrative. It would seem to serve the writer's interest to make Canaan as perverse as possible. Now, let me say, I know we have to wrap up here in just a moment, but let me just say one final thing, and I might touch on this a little bit next week. This is a text that was used in the days leading up to the American Civil War. This was a text that was used by Southern apologists for slavery, to argue that African Americans should be by right, by divine ordinance, slaves to white people. Okay, I'll explain this further in our next session a little bit. And so this story is one that has been used for very we talk about perversity, perverse ends, seen as the real villain or the real scapegoat in the story are not Africans at all. It's Canaan. It's Canaan that's obviously the great enemy in this story. And yet because in the minds of those who worked out the Table of Nations, Ham was said to be the ancestor
Oh,
of Africans.
oh.
See, the curse on Ham then was in the thinking of this pro-slavery apologists, was a curse on Africans. And just as a curse on Canaan would justify the treatment of Canaanites, so in the same way that a curse on the ancestor of all Africans would justify the white enslavement of Ham's descendants, of Africans, of Black Africans. I'll say more about that because it's an example of a scriptural text which has a very, very unfortunate subsequent history. I've studied this because I've just studying my own genealogy and everything, and as you know, that is an aspect of Southern history that my family is no stranger to, and so it's something I've done a lot of background reading in to understand how those kinds of justifications were made, and they were theologically and biblically made to incredibly harmful effect. So, all right. Well, any questions or thoughts or?
Every time you give us a talk, I think of 10 more courses you could teach. One of them would be a history of desire in the Old Testament.
Oh dear. Okay. Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It's
A lot there.
It's because of desire God created the world. It's because of desire that Eve ate the apple, and then there's the Song of Solomon, and then they turn it around here, and it starts getting into perversity. So,
Yeah, and it's also, but desire and longing is also what draws us to God.
exactly.
And God's desire and longing for us is what draws us to God. So
Right.
it's not just a dark, it's just not a dark energy.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
I gotta go to Braveheart, Tom. Bye-bye.
Okay. Enjoy.
Bye.
Love you.
Bye.
Okay.
I-
So yeah. So